Welcome, everyone. It is great to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this SWAT talk about the 2022 midterms and the state of American democracy, featuring Arlie Hochschild, class of 1962. My name is Jason Zengerle. I am the class of 1996, and I'll be the moderator tonight. Before I turn things over to Arlie, I just wanted to go over a few preliminary pieces of business. SWAT Talks is a speaker series brought to you by the Swarthmore Alumni Council, of which I'm a member. Tonight's session will be recorded, so you'll be able to find it online at the SWAT Talks page on the Swarthmore College website within 2 or 3 weeks. If you're interested in watching previous talks, you can also find those on the SWAT Talks page. For those of you who are new to SWAT Talks, or for our regulars who just need a reminder, tonight will go like this. Arlie will present for the first half hour or so, and then we'll finish with our usual question and answer session. Please ask questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom, and please be sure to include your name and class year when you do so. I will collect those questions and will pose as many of them as I can to Arlie during the Q&A session. So I'd like to introduce Arlie Hochschild, one of Swarthmore's most celebrated alums and one of America's most esteemed sociologists. Arlie graduated from Swarthmore in 1962. She earned her master's and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and went on to teach there for several decades. She's the author of 9 books, including The Second Shift about working parents and the division of labor at home, and The Outsourced Self about the intersections between commerce and private life. Most recently, and most relevant to our discussion tonight, Arlie wrote Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. It's a deeply reported and deeply empathetic examination of a deep red community near Lake Charles, Louisiana, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2016. Since Strangers was published 6 years ago, Arlie has been working on another book, interviewing people in Appalachia, specifically the Trump stronghold of Pike County in eastern Kentucky. I first encountered Arlie's work when I was assigned The Second Shift in an introductory sociology class at Swarthmore nearly 30 years ago, and I've been reading and learning from her ever since. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to hear from Arlie tonight about the recently completed midterm elections and what they might tell us about the divisions in our country and the fragile state of our democracy. And with that, I will turn things over to Arlie.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And Swatties all, I'm delighted to see you, be with you. You know, I remember my senior year in the spring, 1962, sitting on the grass in front of Parish Hall and looking at the line of oaks and the beautiful kind of hillside and wondering what I should do with my life. And, well, you know, what would Lucretia Mott want me to do? And never in a million years would I have foreseen that I would spend 5 years off and on among the most polluting petrochemical plants on the earth in the southern port town of Lake Charles, Louisiana, to study members of the Tea Party, soon to become ardent base of support for Donald Trump. And it's the very epicenter of the revolt against virtually every value that was gently and persuasively imparted to me at Swarthmore. But it was because I took to heart Swarthmore's values that if you've got a problem, figure it out, search for truth, and work for a better world, equality of the races. I think these are our values we all share after our 4 years there. That I went down to the Deep South to understand what could be going on for people who were very enthusiastic about undermining those values. So what I thought I could do in the time we have here is start with some good news and then talk about what it is that brought us to this moment and what we can do about it. That's the territory. The good news is that actually a very recent Ford survey it found that 52% of GOP voters believe that the recent November midterm 2022 elections were free and fair. Okay, the good news is that this Stop the Steal, the election was stolen. That the very people who were at the heart of that movement seem to be backing off a little. But I think we are not at all out of the woods. I think that Donald Trump has a very good chance to be selected as the Republican candidate in 2024. So backing up from that, how do we understand the rise of the right and the big divide in our country today? I think we have to first go back to an economic story that I think very often liberal progressives don't count in. From 1970 on, I think we divided into the winners and losers of globalization. That is, there were companies, I'm here in Berkeley looking at Silicon Valley, and high-tech service industries that call for highly educated populations, new companies. Those became the kind of winners of globalization. But there were older companies, older industries that were more vulnerable to offshoring and automation in rural and semi-rural areas and small towns in the Midwest. And they became the losers of globalization. There was a recent study that put together all of the red counties in the country and compared them to all the blue counties in the country, and found that indeed there is an economic difference, and that in blue states, blue counties, income was going up, and red counties, income was going down. I think fundamentally this is a very important thing. It's hard to forget when you're just listening to the hot notes of rhetoric. But how do we then put that? I should add to that economic story, and I'm looking at it certainly in Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, where there can be an exaggerated downward kind of cascade of bad news, so that when you lose your job, if you're in a rural area and you're not moving out, really it feels like the end of things, and there's kind of cultural loss, and not just joblessness, but pridelessness and a devaluation of things that you've always treasured. And opiates have come in big time in blue collar white areas. So, but there's a cultural side to this story. The people that I came to know don't feel that there is a national narrative that tells their story. They feel silenced. They feel colonized, in fact, that people in cities, highly educated, areas are making up values, imposing them on them, and that they are either have to agree or be shamed. So a lot of them are feeling actually that something's been, quote, stolen from them. I should also say that along with this, a national survey has found that people were asked which political party was fighting for working families, as a Republican or Democrat. When I was sitting on the grass in front of Parish Hall, the answer would be for working families, for poor, that would be the Democrats. and it was why it was one. But for white working class, that is without BAs today, the answer is Republican. That it's the Republican Party that they feel represented by. So how do we make sense of this? Let me focus on the whole recap briefly what my work in Louisiana was, and then carry it forward to today. So I went into this red state world, this world where nationwide, as we know, they're poor, they have all of the social signs of poverty. They take more money from the federal government in aid than they give to it in tax dollars, and suspect and revile the federal government. So that's the red state paradox. And so how do they think about things? I came up with an idea of a deep story. And what the deep story is a kind of a distillation of, it's a paradigm in a way. It's a story, but it's a paradigm for how they feel. I formulated this story and then I went back to them. What would you do? Is this work for you? Is this say what you think? If not, how would you change it? And the story is that you are waiting in line and your feet are tired because you've been waiting a long time. It's top of the hill is the American dream. And you are riveted on that dream. You are not looking at the very long line behind you. You feel like you don't begrudge anyone, you're a nice person, but then you see people cutting in line ahead of you. Seems like, and you wonder who's that? Well, that's women who now, through affirmative action initially, are eligible for jobs that used to be reserved for men. And you see Blacks who are now eligible for jobs that used to be reserved for whites. And you see immigrants, and you see refugees, you see highly paid public sector workers. All of these feel to you as if they're cutting the line, preventing you from moving forward. You feel forgotten. And you see Barack Obama, look at him. He seems to be waving to the line cutters. He seems to be favoring them and forgetting him. And finally, in a moment of a deep story, someone ahead of you in line, more educated, more successful, closer to the American dream, turns around and said, "You ignorant, ill-educated, homophobic, sexist, racist, redneck." And then you feel you just want to get out of that line. I went with that story to people who said, "Oh, you read my mind. That is my story. I live your metaphor." Or they would say, "No, you've left something out. The people waiting in line are paying taxes for the people who are cutting in line." And then there was you left out the fact that we get out of line, we secede. It's just to feel fair. Okay, so this is, we can say, chapter 1 of the MAGA story. As we look at the part of the Republican Party that's peeled off into a cult-like section, that would be chapter 1. And then what happens in chapter 2 is Donald Trump comes around. And Donald Trump says to them, "I'm yours and you're mine. I love you, you love me. And with that is, I recognize you. Hold on to that idea. I recognize you. I interviewed a unemployed coal miner recently who had been a coal mine closed down, but he was injured. He took OxyContin for his injury to control the pain. Some years ago, I became an addict. He lost his family, lost custody of his children. He lost his pride. And he said, oh, Donald Trump came to town. And he said, oh, I'm going to bring back coal. I knew he was lying, but I felt he saw who I was. So recognition somehow in his rhetoric and in his, he has communicated this. So that's chapter 2 of a kind of a binding of leader to the followers. And I think a lot of it has to do with their shame and his shamelessness. I believe that they feel no narrative above them. They feel downwardly mobile without an explanation for it, and are suffering what I would call it structural shame. And that he's the guy who, as one guy said, oh, he's like lightning in a jar. Well, what is that lightning in that jar? I think it is his very flawedness from the point, anyone else's point of view. The fact that he takes us through a kind of a 3-moment shame ritual, I believe. Moment 1, he says something outrageous. Oh, all immigrants are rapists and thieves, something like that. Moment 2, the punditry shames him, says, you can't say that. That's outrageous to say something like that. They're good people. Stop it. They shame him. Moment 3, he rails against the shamers. Oh, the treasonous press, the deep state, all these Democrats, PC. So I think they love that. They love the railing against the shamers. And I've tried that out on people I'm talking to. Yeah. Sometimes he just pokes the bear. And of course, the left just falls right in with that. And oh, look, he's poking the bear. Okay, so that's that chapter of binding, chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the deep story, as we move forward in time, is look what I do for you, how I suffer for you. I'm suffering the slings and arrows of this liberal culture that is of this economically winning team that we're now divided into. And there's a beatification. I am suffering for you. And I know that will sound unbelievable, but I do believe that's kind of what I'm hearing. That is how it feels to the people I've come to know. Look how he suffered for us. They're shaming him the way they shame us. And because he's shame-proof, because he's a shame pugilist, he's defending us. Okay, so then we move, that's beatification, to the next chapter, in which he says, look how I've done for you. I am suffering for you. You can see how they're after me. There's a whole narrative of suffering he carries forward. And then he adds to it, so come, you defend me, the call to January 6th. And stand up as a patriot. I'll give you your pride back. You can be dressed up as as the revolutionary heroes. And that brings us to January 6th and kind of the pride shame mashup, as the very people who felt they were defending their great leader are hauled into prison, the FBI arraigned as treasonous, in fact. So there was a whole period of confusion now, and I believe that we are still in that period of confusion. And for the people that I'm looking at, I think they're kind of two groups. One who are just withdrawing from the media, a little bit in mourning, 4 or 5 stages of loss and mourning. It's kind of in retreat. We were misled. And there are others who are second group that are kind of doubling down. So this, what is it, 4th, 5th chapter is one of splitting within the Republican Party. And I'm hearing people saying, well, oh, they're the country club Republicans. I'm not a country club Republican. I'm a populist Republican. And among those, I think there is confusion, but they are still stop the steal. Something has been stolen. And here I'd like to pause on, because I'm sure we are all wondering, certainly I was scratching my head, how could it be with this mountain of evidence that the election was not stolen? It was legitimate. The Supreme Court says it, 50 different state lawsuits all say no, it's safe. I don't need to recite this for you, you know it well. And then we have the January 6th hearings. These people peek at that news, but they know it and still hold on to the idea that the election was stolen. So what goes on here? What is it? I can tell you they're regular people. They're not dumb. They're nice people. We're talking about nearly half the American population. So, but there is magical thinking, and why I feel that what Donald Trump has done in posing himself as the suffering victim of a liberal culture and economy, and promising a new day for the losing side, that he has, in a way, by claiming loss, he's laminated it onto the deep story. In other words, people are understanding the election and the claim of something being stolen because you're seeing it through a sense of many things have been stolen. My prosperity, my American dream, quote, isn't just lost. He moved lost to stolen. He moved the emotional needle. And there, people could point to many things that they used to have, or that their father or grandfather had that they don't have. What's gone missing? Who took it? So he's, in a way, been quite emotionally brilliant at exploiting a kind of an open sore. So that, in a way, I've in a way had to explain this piece of the Republican Party, the MAGA part that's hard to explain, by speaking in emotional Morse code. In a way, I'm trying to translate what I think emotions are into a language that I think we at Swarthmore could normally speak in. And So turning to what we need to do to get out of this hole, I think that answers are multiple, of course, but that one thing is that we all need to speak in Morse code. We all need to be able to hear something crazy and think what's under it. What would be another way of describing that belief? What would be the deep story that's animating it, and why the deep story? I guess I'm advocating kind of a way of understanding people who are angry. They will present with anger, but I think under that is fear and shame. So how to create bridges from one culture to another, one party to another. First thing I should say is that studies show that right-wing people know more, are likely to make more accurate guesses about what Democrats think than Democrats are to make guesses about what Republicans think. In other words, we're all living in bubbles now, but urban, highly educated bubbles where Democrats are concentrated. We're actually more bubbleized than they are. So that's a first thing, a little piece of humble pie for us to eat, I think. And the second thing is to realize that, in the 1960s, 50s, and so on, there was a vibrant labor union movement in this country. And it formed, I think, the main bridge between the working class and the Democratic Party. And because labor unions have been undercut by globalization, basically, as companies just left, you couldn't bargain with them. We need a substitute kind of structure. And in the last actual days of my research in Louisiana, there was a young man, David McCullough, who came with me, and he met all the people that I came to know there. And he has started a high school national project called the American Exchange Project. And actually, Bob Putnam, another Swati, is on the board of this with us. And what he has done is to take high school seniors, they get to know each other on Google, and then they arrange visits with one another. You get Southern high school, public high school kids to visit people in the North visit kids in the South. You get coastal kids inland kids to the coast, 3-week visits. And you don't start with politics. You start with, gosh, what's it like here? What do you eat? What are the jobs? And I think that kind of civic, kind of intelligence growing experience would be great. I don't think it's enough, and but it's a start to build kind of a more cosmopolitan culture. So, and one that increased recognition across the differences. So there are many more things I could say, but maybe we'll stop there and we'll open it up for questions,
That'd be great.
comments.
Thank you so much, Arlie. That was fantastic. We have a bunch of questions. I will try to get through as many as I possibly can before we run out of time. The first one is that I'm going to ask is from Spencer Jones, class of 13, and he has a question about the phenomenon of wanting to be quote unquote seen or understood by a politician while knowing that the politician's policies will do little to help the actual circumstances of one's life. Is this a universal political phenomenon, or is there something historically unique about these particular circumstances?
Wow, these questions are golden. I don't think this is unique, but it's certainly, I think, exaggerated in this instance. There's a feeling, and I felt it with so many interviews of people, they would start. So this isn't exactly the question, but I'm elaborating a little bit on the experience of talking to people who don't feel recognized. They feel, some of the first things they would say to me is, oh, you know, what are you doing here? Why are you here? I said, well, I'm worried about the divide. They say, oh yeah, we're worried about that divide too. And then they would say, but we think people like you, you know, on the coasts, think we are backward and dumb, uneducated. And I said, well, I'm interested in telling the real story here. So would you let me into your life? Can I get to know you? You know, where are your ancestors buried? And, you know, take me to church. Let me look at your life, and I will commit to trying to correct that message if it needs correction. And they, so it began with, you don't recognize us. That was the first thing they would say to me time and time again. So I think it's, of course, a politician's tool. But so any politician will go and say, I'm trying to understand who you are. But some people are better at it than others. And charismatic leaders who come in and promise heaven, it's not just the heaven they're promising. They're directing it to an injury, to a sense of injured pride. Of course, in the case of Appalachia, things got worse after Trump. He did not deliver in any way. Same thing with Louisiana. So
this is
I'm leaving that question there. It's a great question.
Yeah,
I think I can't answer it beyond that.
This is a question from Barry Shkolnick. I don't know his class, but he notes that his former high school best friend is a college graduate, an engineer, had a long career at Intel, and he is now a full-on MAGA election denier and all the rest. I've been befuddled by his conversion. I'm not sure the quote-unquote story you have brilliantly set out explains him. Any ideas on how to understand this type of person?
Yeah, that's great. The people that I met who were actually, paradoxically, the most ardent were people I would call the elite of the left behind. They were not the abject poor. They had gone to college. You know, maybe it was an online college, maybe it was 2 years, maybe it took a few years getting through. But they were anguished and aggrieved at the kind of decline of the region and their town and their family. They felt urged to be a leader in a place that was falling down. And they often, the people that I came to think of as the most ardent were people who knew how much better it was elsewhere. Like one guy I met is a real stayer. There's a big in Appalachia, you're a stayer or a leaver. And if you're a stayer, you really committed, you wanted to make your reputation, be a leader in a place where you grew up and valuing everything that was there in that place. And this guy, though, had a job that took him here, there, the other place. And he could come back and say, we're a mess, but we don't have. And look at how they look down on us. We don't exist for them. No narrative for us. So they became obsessed with the comparison in a way between blue states and red states. And so I think what we could do, and this is just beginning, is kind of collect the conditions under which people like Mr. Skolnick's friend, college educated friend, could get the MAGA message and have it speak to him. Yeah, that would be what I can do with that.
This is a question from Lawrence Phillips. What other than understanding can be offered to those who realistically have been left behind?
I think that actually Joe Biden's Build Back Better is a huge kind of potential, a sort of shot in the arm for the people I'm talking to. But what's missing with all of those opportunities for blue collar skill building and job opportunities is a narrative of recognition. I mean, what was so brilliant about Great Again is that it implies a decline, a fall. It's an answer to a fall. And Hillary Clinton was just saying, oh, hey, you just have to work hard and get there. Didn't speak to them. They felt that was a slap in the face in a way. So what can realistically be given? Here's an example. Actually, I did an op-ed on this, but there's a Democratic congressman here, Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley. So Google, Facebook, you name it, he represents it here. Democrat. He says, look, I have a lot of immigrants here, and I'm immigrant myself, where my parents were. And we outsource coding jobs to Bangalore in India. But what I'm proposing, he said, is to insource those jobs to Middle America. And he got together with a Republican, Hal Rogers of Paintsville, Kentucky, who said, hey, let's make Silicon holler. And they went and did it. And I went to look at the training program and interviewed the people whose lives were transformed from putting sandwiches together at Subway for $7.50 an hour, or working the night shift at Hotel 6 for 10. They were now in $70,000 a year jobs, and so that could be replicated. And actually, Kana has a book out and proposing that, and I think it's a great idea. So that's the kind of thing that it could be amplified. There are some good ideas that we just need to beef up.
This question is from David Gelber, class of 63. He asks, how do your friends in Kentucky think about the climate issue, and how should people like us talk to them about it?
You know, there is a lot of possible crossover on climate, Dave, and great to hear you. And by the way, Swatties, Dave has in his work done more than almost anyone I know to help get a climate a winning issue across this country. Thank you, Dave, for your work. But I would give you an example of a guy who is a big MAGA advocate. And I asked him what he did for his line of work. He said, "Oh, I grow hemp." I said, what do you grow hemp for? "Oh, I'm getting," in fact, all the hemp farmers, 40 different hemp farmers together to create a biomass, which we're putting together with municipal waste. And that can be used to for natural gas that could could be mixed with the fuel line for Delta Airlines. Oh, my goodness, but he's a coal guy. He's very interested in wind and solar. And a lot of these people are talking about getting solar panels on the top of sawed off mountains and sawed off for the coal. So I think if it's an economic opportunity and it's presented with recognition and no put down, I think it's a crossover issue.
This is a question from Perry Chang, class of 85, who has some personal experience in Hazard, Kentucky. And the question is, what have you picked up from your research there, if anything, that is different from what you found in Louisiana? How much do you think that might be a function of several years and tumultuous political events having passed, and how much from a different culture or different economic base?
It feels like a different version of the same deep story. And the version is different in that the economy is very much up and down depending on the demand for coal. So I think they've been harder hit than Louisiana, although both are are fuel related economies. And I think the culture is different. It's they're less religious. I think they're more isolated from Blacks. And more generally suspicious of government. So I think there are different cultural roots, but it's a version of the deep story. But some change has to do with time. In other words, I would have found it in Louisiana. It's not region related. And I asked one guy, I told him about the deep story, and he said, well, you're waiting in line, really imagine that someone in line has been beating you up. There's a bully in line. And then another guy fights the bully. And the guy that fights the bully in line isn't perfect. He's kind of a counter bully, but he's your bully. That's the story we're in. And he said, I don't think Donald Trump is a great guy. He's got flaws, but he's our bully. And you need a guy that big to almost make up, to be like a government. So that is kind of the alteration to the deep story that I'm finding that has to do, I think, with recent events.
This is a question from Sanda Balaban. She asks, are you finding differences in the outlook of the young people in this communities, and what are the implications for bridge building?
wonderful. Hi, Sanda. I love Sanda. Who's a dear friend of our son, David, who's also a Swati. So, and is the is the godmother of our granddaughters. So yeah, you know, I was sticking with all these oldsters, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And not as old as me, but oldsters, and they are far more likely to be conservative than their kids. And I think we need more reach out to young kids, but they are the young ones. Some of these new coders that I mentioned, who are younger, were much more socially progressive. But they felt actually pushed back by a sense that they were not recognized again by other young people on the coast. They were quite diffident and felt that there's a missing empathy bridge. I think I can envision a young to young, a kind of set of connections that aren't there. But I met people that felt they were interested in urban people. And one woman, for example, said, you know, I grew up in all white area. I wish I hadn't. You know, I'd be interested to get to know people that are different from me. So that's not the stereotype, but I do report I've heard this.
This question is from Atanuk Lardner, and I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation of your name, and class of 22. Can you speak more to the relationship between the quote unquote left behind and whiteness? What would you say to the argument that the rise of the right is a movement of whiteness and that the left behind aren't as isolated from educated whites as they might like to think?
Yeah, I think that I like that question a lot. I think the left behind is race-based, but not just race-based. I think it's part of a collage of left behinds. So that's the simple answer to it. But there is a sense that actually, you know, Blacks are getting ahead. They're doing better than we are. And so there's an envy thing there. At the same time, you know, a lot of them are saying, you know, what's the difference between hood and holler? I mean, you know, in Louisville, for example, you know, you've got people that aren't working, unemployed, they're on welfare. Here, there are a lot of people who are unemployed on welfare. There, got addiction. Here, we've got addiction. What's the difference? You know, as crime in the street, you're frightened. We've got that too. And one guy said, I don't see any difference between living in Murray Trailer Court and Eastern Kentucky and living in the center of Chicago, you know, white to black similarity. And then I mentioned that to another guy I talked to, and he said, oh, I haven't heard about hillbilly. Oh, I said, there's no difference except for the music. We've got twangy music and they've got rap. And then the next person I talked to said, oh, well, they haven't heard about hillbilly rap. So even the music was similar. So, okay, what about, the whole acknowledgement of the history of slavery and discrimination? No, I think not. But I think there's a start. Maybe you're talking to an optimist here, but there is a recognition of social class, and they feel, the young people I've talked to, that class has been dropped out of the story by the left. Left is talking about race, it's talking about gender, it's talking about sexuality, but it is not talking about what you would think would be basic to the left, social class. I'm hearing that among you young on the right.
This is a question from Deborah Vagins, class of 91. She asked, do you have any recommendation for how we might depoliticize economic issues that have become partisan because they were winning for Democrats, but they've now alienated Republicans? These initiatives help people in both parties, of course, but have been more polarized in recent years. In particular, she's thinking of issues that would have been addressed in the second shift, pay equity, paid leave, etc.
There is a book, and I think it's called Turn Left. It's by a guy named Lopez, which has tried out 3 basic kinds of appeal. It's really an important thing he's done. The 3 kinds of democratic appeal to blue-collar America. One is to just talk about economics, and just that, leave race out of it. That's one. The second is to appeal, as Donald Trump does, to race. And the third is to mix an appeal of economic improvements with racial equity improvements. So you've got, what he's done is to look at persuadables as people that don't always vote one party, or they're in the middle, they're independents, those persuadables. And he says, I think about 40%, actually a high percent of people are extremes, they're persuadables. And he's trying these 3 kinds of appeal out on these persuadables and discovering that when you present persuadable with a combination of both economic policies that are going to help everybody of a certain class and racial improvement, you're improving racial equality, that third category of appeals works better than the other 2. So Haney Lopez, is the guy that's done this. And so I think he's made a contribution there.
I think we only have time for one more question, unfortunately. I'm going to try to combine a few. This has sort of been a theme running throughout the Q&As. And it's a question about whether a national post-high school or post-college term of service would help at all in terms of bridging some of these gaps, giving people some sort of common story that they could tap into, and whether you think that would be a good and useful idea to trying to solve some of these divisions.
I love that suggestion. And I wonder if Lucretia Mott, a face on the hallway as you go in for dinner every day in Parrish. It was there when I was there.
It might be gone now.
Times have changed. Okay, both the picture and the location of dinner, but that's a very Swarthmore idea. It's a wonderful idea, and I'd love to see it happen. And what bad could happen I mean, already these students, these high school students in this kind of fledgling project that I've just mentioned, are transformed, and they're talking a little differently. And I think to have it be something everybody does would be great. The only other institutions we have are the Army, that puts people of different social classes and races together, and labor unions. Some of them did that. And so I think it's a great idea for a new kind of solution to the divide we're faced with.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much, Arlie, for doing this tonight. I'm really sorry we were not able to get we had a ton of questions. I think we had, close to 60, and I think I was able to ask 9. So I apologize to everyone I did not get to. And hopefully the answers that you were able to hear were helpful. But thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Arlie, for doing this. And this was great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jason.
Bye.